As always, please retry this question before watching the video. There's several things you know to be able to answer this question. If you don't know the answer, please add it to your cheat sheet, master it, and go back 5 before continuing in the video. What is another way to recognize clause questions? That is if the dependent clause markers change from answer to answer. If the dependent clause markers change from answer to answer, which could just be one dependent clause marker showing up. That's probably going to be the right answer, FYI, if that happens. But yeah, even if you just see one dependent clause marker in one of the answers, that is probably a clause question that you're dealing with. What is the difference between a clause and a phrase? A clause has a subject-verb combo. A phrase does not. What is the easiest way to recognize a dependent clause? Starts with a dependent clause marker. What is the easiest way to recognize an independent clause? It does not start with a dependent clause marker. What are 10 magic dependent clause markers? Because, while, when, since, whereas, who, whom, whose, which, that. Because, while, when, since, whereas, who, whom, whose, which, that. What are our 3 main sentence structures? Independent plus independent, independent plus dependent, dependent plus independent. How do we punctuate independent plus independent? One of the 5 ways. What are the 5 ways? Comma fanboys, period, semicolon, m dash, colon. With those in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at number 16. It is quite easy if you know these things. So, first thing we got to recognize is that while is in one of our answers. Therefore, we have a dependent clause marker. Therefore, we want to consider if this is a clause question. You should probably just be considering all the time if things are clause questions because ACT loves to do these clause questions. All right. So with that in mind, in September 3rd, 1938, he traveled up the Pacific coast. Hobbyist photographer Charles Cushman loaded his da-da-da. All right. So here we have 2 clauses. He traveled. It does not start with a dependent clause marker. Therefore, it is an independent clause. Hobbyist photographer Charles Cushman loaded. That is a subject-verb combo. Hobbyist is not a dependent clause marker. Therefore, this is also an independent clause. So we have 2 independent clauses, and they did not use one of the 5 ways to separate them. Therefore, F is wrong because the clauses are separated improperly. Remember, anytime you find one thing wrong, that same thing's probably going to be wrong about at least one of the other answers, if not all the other wrong answers. So G is the same thing. He was this independent clause. Hobbyist photographer Charles Cushman loaded is an independent clause. So this is 2 clauses separated by a comma, which is not one of the 5 ways. So G is wrong because clauses are separated improperly. And then J does not have a verb. So it's not going to be the same issue here. Travel up the Pacific coast. Hobbyist photographer Charles Cushman loaded. It is just awkwardly worded, okay? We can eliminate J because it is awkwardly worded. That just leaves us with H. While traveling up the Pacific coast. All right, so while is a dependent clause marker. And this isn't even a clause because they removed the verb. So there is no verb, there is no subject-verb combo, therefore it's not a clause. But just to keep our lives easy, if it starts with a dependent clause marker, you can just go ahead and consider it a dependent clause because it's going to operate the same way, needing a comma separating it from the clause. So either way, whether it is a dependent clause or not a dependent clause, we're going to treat it like a dependent clause. And we have dependent followed by independent. We separate that with comma always. And they did not do that. Or they did do that on answer H, and so this is confirmed our correct answer. If this made sense to you, please add it to your worksheet and write what you learned along with the right answer, and continue on to do the remaining Clause 3 questions that you missed on this test. If this is the last Clause 3 question that you missed on this test, please go ahead and do the Clause 3 mastery until you get 10 questions correct in a row before coming back and continuing on the next category that you missed the most of.